What goes on in the brain when you eat ultra processed foods and sugar from a medical and psychological perspective that would cause somebody to experience things like depression and anxiety from it?
So I'll talk a little bit about the science, but I just want to say before I do that, that we actually have strong epidemiological evidence for this. In humans, we're not really allowed to do randomized controlled trials of, taking a group of 1,000 patients or people and putting half of them on a high ultra processed diet and the other half not. If we make the assumption that this ultra processed diet is probably going to make them really depressed, ethics boards often won't allow that because they know that you're almost intending to do harm to people. So the strongest evidence we have is epidemiological evidence. So looking at people who are already consuming whatever diet they're consuming and whatever types of foods. And we know from one large study of over 300,000 people from around the world, people who consume ultra processed foods every day, multiple times a day, are 3 times more likely to have poor mental health than people who rarely or never consume them. And that 3 times more likely was really significant. The group that was consuming ultra processed foods all the time, 60% of them, more than half, had poor mental health, whereas only 20% of the people in the rarely or never consuming ultra processed foods had poor mental health. So that's a significant factor. I want to point out, is it the only factor? Of course not. You could have trauma and stress or other things going on that can drive poor mental health. So we know from studies like that, and there are many other studies documenting that people who consume a lot of ultra processed foods are more likely to have depression or poor mental health. And then if you get into the biology of it, like what is that? How does that work? What is that doing? It gets super complicated. Lots of things we don't know, but the general kind of things that we do know are that high levels of this type of food are more likely to cause what's something called oxidative stress, which can trigger inflammation even in your brain. And those are both kind of symptoms of something deeper that's called mitochondrial dysfunction. So this food that we're eating can cause our metabolism or our mitochondria more specifically to become impaired or dysregulated. And that can lead to high levels of inflammation and other things. And when that starts to happen, the brain can begin to become sluggish. People can experience brain fog. And in some cases, the brain can actually begin to overtly malfunction so that people start having anxiety for no reason, just out of the blue. They just have a panic attack for no reason.
Do you find that in these studies, or even the people that you've consulted with, could potentially have an unhealthy user bias, meaning like the people who are eating ultra processed foods probably may not also, they don't exercise. Maybe they're excessively drinking, doing drugs, smoking cigarettes. Have you found that to be true?
It's an actually really important question. And in the study that I mentioned, the one with 300,000 people, they actually controlled for exercise and they controlled for socioeconomic status, thinking that maybe that was it. Maybe people who don't exercise and are rich are more likely to consume a lot of ultra processed foods, or maybe the other way, people who don't exercise and are poor are more likely to. What they found is that even when they controlled for exercise, the ultra processed food signal was very strong and still there. And even when they controlled for socioeconomic status, it didn't matter. The more ultra processed foods you eat, the worse your mental health.
And so for somebody who has poor mental health, I mean, I think from my own personal experience, people who have poor mental health also have a negative outlook on life. They don't have a lot of self-confidence. They're already like dealing with a variety of issues, but they also have to make these changes that you're talking about. What is your, as a psychiatrist and somebody who studied the brain, do you have any advice on how people can take simple steps so that they're not necessarily just like waking up one day and being like, you know what, like I got to just completely overhaul my life, and they don't have the confidence to do so?
So you just gave the first piece of advice. You don't have to do it all at once. Tiny, simple steps are the key. And In my mind, the first step is actually education. So just explaining this to people, making sure they understand that what you're putting in your mouth day after day is actually having an impact on your brain and the way you feel. And so the first step is just education and awareness. And then the second step is motivating them to change. And people will never be motivated to change without what I sometimes call step one in any recovery journey, which is hope. They have to believe that if I'm going to make a change, there is at least a chance that this could make my life better. And so I'm going to do it. I'm going to give it a try. They have to have at least a glimmer of hope. And for some people with mental health conditions, that's not hard at all. Some people are desperate to feel better. And you can have this conversation with them and they're like, I'm in. I'm going to just give it all up. I'm going to give it a couple weeks and I'm going to see if I feel better or not. That'll be great. But other people, they're already hopeless. Part of their illness makes them feel hopeless. And so for them, it can be more challenging. Because again, if they're already hopeless and you're saying, come on, you can do it, they're really internally saying to themselves, no, I can't. Come on, you can feel better. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what it's like to be me. You don't know how bad my life is. This has nothing to do with my diet. And that's the way it will feel to people. When they're really depressed, depression doesn't feel like, oh, I'm sick from an upset stomach because I ate something bad. That's not the way this works. The way this works is you're eating food that just tastes good to you. And you just feel like my life sucks. I'm tired all the time. I'm burned out. My life really doesn't matter that much. And those are the symptoms. I'll call them thoughts, but those are symptoms of what it's like to be depressed. And so I think part of the conversation with somebody who's stuck in that is helping them understand, no, this is depression. You actually really do matter. You are somebody. You are smart. You have things going for you. Like if you really believe that, that's depression. And that's something that we should fight. You should fight this. I want to help you fight this. Like, let's fight this. Like, you're better than this, and you shouldn't have to feel this way.
Do you think it's important for people to understand like the root cause of their depression? Meaning you've talked about how if they eat a highly processed food diet, that can cause stuff to happen in the brain that can potentially lead to bouts of depression, etc. But then there's also things like trauma and, adverse circumstances and job loss and divorce that could also lead to depression. Do you think there's merit in like discovering the root of it, or do you think it's all the same?
There's 100% merit in discovering what the roots are for all of the obvious reasons. Dealing with a breakup or a job loss is challenging. It's difficult. I'm not trying to say it's simple, but it's understandable. Most people understand, okay, this is the process you have to go through. You're allowed to grieve for a little while. Of course, you're going to feel awful about it. Nobody's going to feel good about a job loss the next day. And that's all not fine and well, but your friends and family are going to give you a few days or a few weeks to grieve. And then they're going to start kind of kicking you in the butt, so to speak, and be like, come on, you got to get going. No, you can't mope anymore. Come on, you got to get another job. Let's start looking. Let's start putting in your applications. You're somebody. You're worthwhile. You'll find another job. You're not going to let this defeat you. And that may be the solution if that is, in fact, the root cause. The tricky part is that when people have had trauma and social adversity, that can be the root cause initially. But it can lead to this whole cascade of biological events that really beat the person down, so to speak. And at the end of the day, the way I think about it is that those events impair their metabolic health, their brain metabolism too. And so those are the people that can become chronically depressed or have PTSD symptoms. And at the same time, they're more likely to be putting on weight. They're more likely to have higher blood glucose levels. They're more likely to have high blood pressure. They're more likely to develop cardiovascular disease. All of those symptoms are symptoms of metabolic problems. And I'm really a big fan of putting that all together. And when somebody gets to that point, talking about the trauma can be part of the treatment, but more than likely it won't be sufficient to reverse the metabolic harm that has occurred. And in order to reverse the metabolic harm that's occurred, that person may need to be extra diligent about dietary interventions or exercise interventions or sleep interventions or other things.